Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out for our Crisis Management Conference. I'm Susan Bocamazzo. I'm the publisher over at Mass Lawyers Weekly. To start out, I want to give people the Wi-Fi password, which you're all probably waiting to find out about. The username is Lawyers Weekly, all lowercase, and I think it might be written down over there. And there it is. And the password is 120 Tremont, again, lowercase on Tremont. And that should work. And you want to use the Suffolk guest access. One other thing I'm going to point out, around on the tables, there are leaders in the law nomination forums. If you know an in-house attorney who you think should be honored for their work, please go ahead and take one and fill it out. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. Our sponsors for this event are enabling us to put this on. I think it is going to be a really informative day with a lot of information about handling crises, which is an issue that comes up all the time. We see in the news all the time companies dealing with data breach, companies dealing with financial crises, with workplace misconduct. So this is, I think, a really timely day, and I think you're going to get a lot of really great information. The sponsors for today are Coveris, Morrison Mahoney, Rasky Partners, and Reputation 911. And later on, we'll be having Lon Povich, who I'm sure all of you know is legal counsel to Governor Charlie Baker, coming in as our keynote speaker at the lunch hour. Our first presentation is on managing financial crises and criminal investigations. We have two speakers here from Rasky Partners. Justine Griffin is a managing director. Justine leads the firm's public relations practice, where she specializes in working with clients who find themselves at the nexus of media, government, and business. She specializes in crisis and issues management, specialty areas for which the firm is known. In crisis and reputation management, clients come to Justine and her team when the stakes are high, including bet the company litigation, government investigations, high-profile business disputes, data breach, mergers, or reputational threats for businesses and nonprofits throughout New England, D.C., and beyond. The team provides strategic counsel to leading institutions, global corporations, major healthcare players, corporate boards, companies, colleges, and universities, as well as nonprofits and trade associations. In issue management and advocacy, Justine works with clients seeking to move and shape public opinion around issues being debated and deliberated in the halls of Congress and state houses. With her is Doug Bailey, senior advisor. Doug draws on his extensive media and public relations background and has played a key role in devising communication strategies that support organizations' business initiatives, including professional sports team acquisitions, publication launches, branding efforts, and business endeavors. As senior advisor, Doug has worked with major corporations, organizations, coalitions, and individuals on issues involving litigation, employee disputes, industrial accidents, product recalls, government prosecution, and medical malpractice. Before entering the PR world, Doug spent 15 years as a journalist over at the Boston Globe, where he held a variety of positions, including business reporter and deputy business editor. I'm going to turn the conversation over to Doug and Justine.
Last time?
Yes.
Thanks for coming. Good morning. If this works, I'm going to stand and move around.
He's a professor.
Somebody said I look like Kavanaugh sitting there, and I really don't want to do that. He did.
Patrick said
You're going to hear a lot about crisis communications today, crisis management, and so forth. So I'm not going to deal with a lot of the foundational elements of crisis communications, because the foundational elements are preparation and planning. And I expect a lot of you know that. And if you don't, my card is up there. You can. So we're going to focus on financial crises, and as my colleague Justine has reminded me, almost every crisis eventually becomes a financial crisis. Like, for example, she mentioned Columbia Gas, which obviously started out as homes exploding and people dying and people being displaced, and now is a crisis of whether or not they can survive financially. So, and that's the way, nobody here from Columbia Gas, is there? They're busy. There is calm. They're busy. But there are unique elements of dealing with financial crises, whether it's a bank or brokerage or any financial kind of transactions that go on in companies. And one of them is you're starting in a hole. And the reason is there's something called the Edelman, what is it called? Trust barometer. And financial firms, banks are always at the bottom. People do not trust them. They don't understand, especially in a crisis, they don't really understand what's going on, what the financial, I mean, most people can't balance a checkbook, so, you know, when you get in a situation where you have to try to describe what's going on inside the institution financially, it gets very complicated. But you're already starting in a hole because the public thinks you're crooks anyway, or at least you're up to no good most of the time. And the PR department is just trying to put lipstick on a pig and make it look pretty and spin it. And so you're starting behind what I call the power curve. I'm a pilot, and there's something called the power curve when you're coming in for a landing, and the opposite things you have to do to land properly. So you're in a hole already. Secondly, the media that you're dealing with. There are good reporters out there. I was one. But generally they don't understand. They don't have the time to really understand financial issues and financial transactions. So your job, or at least our job as crisis managers, becomes that much more difficult because we have to try to explain this and contain it and deal with an audience that really doesn't understand what's going on. And finally, or additionally, I know there are some lawyers in the room, and I don't want to upset them or anything, but everybody thinks they know how the media works, and nobody does, except me. No, what I mean is you need an expert, or at least an experienced person who's dealt with the media to really. What I tell my students, I teach occasionally at BU, and what I tell my students is that if you can anticipate how the media will react, particularly in a crisis, it gives you an enormous advantage of how to deal with whatever it is you're trying to deal with. It works throughout all levels of public relations. If you can anticipate how the media will react. And an experienced communicator, experienced crisis manager, experienced PR person should be able to anticipate how the media will react. There's many times, I'm replete with stories about how I've impressed clients with anticipating or predicting how the media would react to certain events or stories and so forth. So that's why, you know, I actually wrote a column for Mass Weekly some time ago about the conflict between PR people and lawyers. And Justine was saying just a few moments ago that when you get into those entanglements, the lawyers always win because they can scare the hell out of the client and say, well, if you want to be paying legal fees for the rest of your life, yeah, sure. So, but there is a natural tension between PR and lawyers that are going to, you have to live with and try to figure out. Lawyers are extremely risk averse, and I'm not saying that PR people are risky, but it's a different, the court of public opinion is different from the court of law. And you sometimes have to do different things for each of those courts, and sometimes the lawyers don't allow that. So, but my rule is always, I tell clients, don't let the lawyers run your crisis response. But sometimes that falls on deaf ears. Secondly, I want to impress on some of you, you may not know when you're in crisis. That sounds crazy. Of course you know when you're in crisis. But realistically, some companies don't. The biggest example I can come up with is Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo had this deal with their salespeople that they got a bonus. They got bonus incentives if they cross-sold. Somebody has a mortgage, you sell them an auto loan. Somebody has a checking account, you sell them a savings account. And they got a bonus every time they opened an account. Well, it didn't take too long for people to figure out, the salespeople to figure out, they could just open the accounts, and the customer didn't even know that they also had a checking account, or they also had a credit card, or whatever. The salespeople got the bonuses, and this was not a small, this was thousands of people at Wells Fargo that were doing this, open up these phony accounts in order to get the bonuses. The top executives at the company found out about it, and they just said, well, we'll get rid of these people. That's it. Never thinking apparently that when this explodes in the public realm, it's going to be a gigantic scandal. Well, they found out eventually, and it did, and it cost them a huge fine. But the point is, that they didn't see it as a crisis. They just saw it as a management issue we need to deal with. They didn't see it as a public crisis. The companies need to have an issues management. PR and even crisis management is not about promotion, not just about promotion. You need an issues management person who has their ear to the ground, that can spot these things and take it to senior management, has the respect of senior management, and will know that, yes, this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. Now, most companies today, I think, are realizing that you don't have to be a big company like Wells Fargo to be tripped up in a crisis mode. You know, what was it Trump said about the 400-pound guy in the cellar sitting in his underwear with an internet connection can screw up a company big time. So you need people watching that. The example I give sometimes is Comcast, which has a terrible reputation with customer relations. However, you know, I was having trouble with Comcast one day, and they said they were going to be at the house between 2 and 5, and I sat at the house those hours, and they never showed up. And so I tweeted it out. You know, Comcast sucks or whatever. You know, I wasn't that bad. I was polite, but I said, you know, I'm sitting here all day. Immediately, I get a call from the company. They came over, they fixed me, they gave me HBO for a month for free. And if you look on their website now, I don't think it's just because of me, but they don't give you that window anymore. They say, oh, we'll be there from 2 to 5. They give you a definite time. So they reorganized how they do customer service as a result of the power that consumers have now to, you know, interact directly with the company. Another example I had, I'm a popcorn connoisseur. I like small seed white popcorn. So I went into Whole Foods one day, and they said they don't sell this. There's this company called Little Pops in Connecticut. They said they didn't sell it anymore. So I tweeted it out. I immediately got a message from the president of the company asking me for my phone number. He calls and said, wanted to know what store I had been to. I told him, he called me back, and he said, no, we delivered a pallet there yesterday. They were wrong. The next day, a pallet of popcorn showed up on my porch. He sent a pallet for me. I tried it the next day. I said, my Ferrari is not working. It didn't work. But the point is, you can head off crises by having somebody monitoring what's going on. Domino's Pizza found this out when there was a film that got up on YouTube of somebody spitting in the pizza. Their initial reaction was, well, it's just YouTube, who cares? They learned very quickly that this thing goes around the world 1,000,000 times before you can get out of bed. And they dealt with it. Now they're being credited with managing this crisis properly, but it took them a while to do it. They went up with their own YouTube video. And so it's important that you have the issues management is at the foundation of crisis. And of course, I mentioned preparation, that I wasn't going to talk much about preparation, but companies will spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on liability insurance and workers' comp insurance and da-da-da-da-da, and they won't think of crisis as an insurance policy. I know Justine and I could tell you 1,000,000 times how many times we get a call from people who said, the Globe's going to do a story tomorrow, what can you do? You know, there was somebody from UMass here. See? UMass was a perfect example. They called me one time and said that ABC News was going to do a story on Thursday. They called me on Monday. Saying it was 2020. And they were going to call UMass the most violent campus in the country. And this was right during the time when they're trying to get applications in from high schools and so forth. And this was going to be devastating. But I said to him, the first thing I said to him, how is it you're just telling me this now? It's Monday and the show is running Thursday. Didn't you know that they were doing this? And I said, well, they were on the campus this summer filming. I said, that's when you call me. Turned out it was, the data that they used was all outdated and wrong, and we really jumped on that one, and it turned out to be a success. But they still went ahead with the story, but there was so many caveats to it that it just felt like a fist on a pillow. It didn't matter. But my point is, we could have done even better with more heads up. So you have to know when you're in crisis, which some companies don't. They don't realize they're in crisis. And you have to prepare for it. You have to have time to prepare for it. So those are the main points I want to make. Now, Justine is going to talk about a sort of related issue of investigation, criminal investigations, when crisis turns criminal, grand jury investigations and so forth. And I'll jump in when I can. But.
Okay, good, thanks. I'm just gonna sit, can people hear me?
You want my mic pack?
So we've worked with all manner of clients being investigated by a full range of state and federal authorities, and I actually took a look to see over the past couple of years what relevant parties are, and it's the attorneys general in various states, as you would expect, but also DEA, SEC, FTC, FDA. In healthcare, we've done a lot with federal HHS, and it's atrociously named Office of Civil Rights that is the one that hands out the fines on data breach. And the counterparts at the state level, of course, in health and human services. We've worked with the Board of Registration in Medicine, and then beyond that, EPA and others, and then the principal ones of FBI, local law enforcement, U.S. Attorney, and again, the Attorneys General. And what you see consistently with these there are some particular challenges when your client's facing an investigation. As Doug and I were talking about, as Doug referenced, we were talking about that tension that always exists between legal and the PR team, where you're trying to make sure you win the battle in the court of law, but also make sure that they can come out with a reputation intact, because if you lose either one, you eventually lose. When when any kind of government investigation, criminal or civil, is in play, typically PR is a far distant second. Everything is about the investigation, and it makes sense, of course, because of what the priorities are. The other piece of it is all the news, all the announcements are completely controlled by the government, and you kind of just have to make sure that you're in the same news cycle, for example, of when they announce a fine against your company. You don't wait to see if the media is going to reach out to you. You have to push your own statement out to make sure that you're in those stories.
And they're doing that.
Right. Yeah, and then, of course, I think in the case of investigations involving grand juries, that's its own level of complexity, and what we've seen is just the most vicious game of leaking that I've witnessed, having been involved in a few of those. I mean, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and more than one, I'm not just picking on our recent past attorney, U.S. Attorney here, they work the media really hard. It's very much part of their strategy, and they do it for a number of reasons. Frequently, they're trying to flip the people that they're bringing in to see if they'll turn on their boss or on their client or on their colleague. And they're also trying to see if the news articles will generate new witnesses, new victims, et cetera. And so they, we worked on one that was quite high profile and quite tense here a couple of years ago, and the U.S. Attorney was pushing the story at the Globe. The Globe didn't do it, and then a story popped in the Herald, and the Globe freaked out and wrote the story, and it's this kind of game of chicken or something that was really difficult to control, because the reverse side of that, of course, is if your company or you personally are involved in this, you're not supposed to acknowledge that you even were before the grand jury, much less comment on it. So it's one time in grand juries that's particularly difficult to figure out reputationally, and we kind of look at it as there's the during process while grand juries are impaneled. You really can't do much except say all the right sort of good government things like, we look forward to the investigation being concluded, we're participating, never say cooperating, that always sounds terrible. That type of thing. And then, with the hopes that you have already developed a plan that when charges are filed or when it's concluded, you can begin to tell your story, if you can get it by the lawyers. So my other, and then a couple of the basics of criminal investigations is, in addition to U.S. Attorney, Attorneys General, all of them, they have their own PR team. And they have their own strategy. As Doug was saying yesterday, Belichick doesn't go into a game without a game plan. Neither does the Attorney General, on media specifically. And, we've had several people in our office come out of the Attorney General's PR shop, and, and they give you insight into how this is going to play. And it's not really different from anybody else's role in PR of you're trying to get media attention. So they will say, this is the biggest fine ever, levied on a company. This is the first time that this type of behavior is held to, the standard or whatever the case. They're just trying to make it biggest, best, first, et cetera. And then, because that's what the media covers, as Doug can tell you, having, sat for many years in the newsroom making those decisions, they look for that type of thing. So, that's what they'll push, and then they even have a threshold of, if it's this number, it's going to be the press conference, and Maura Healey will be there, and she'll be surrounded by the people who did the investigation. If it's lower than this amount, it's probably going to be a press release. It'll be, we won't issue it later than 3 o'clock in the day, so you can tell a client if it hasn't come out by then, you're probably good till tomorrow, that kind of stuff. And then we really do, which is somewhat unusual. It's this weird thing, if your company's about to be sanctioned in some manner, we'll tell them to push a statement out, even if no one's calling you for comment, because they're gonna cover it. Clients kind of say, well, wait a second, why don't I need to just wait to see? Like, no, because they're gonna own 100% of that article if you don't say anything. And sometimes you're limited, obviously, in what you can say, because there's an element of admitting liability or not fighting that your behavior, that the sanction was somehow appropriate. And we've seen, obviously, one of the things that's interesting is you see both good actors and bad actors struggle with the same thing. And I'll give you an example. We worked with a major academic medical center here, one of Boston's most high-profile elite hospitals. And they found out that one of their nurses was able to override the drug distribution. Like, there's a code, it's for controlled substances, specifically prescription medicine. So, she's getting OxyContin or something for a patient. There was a way to override and get a few more pills. And, it wasn't clear yet whether it was feeding her own habit, selling, how widespread it was. This one person more. Second they found it out, they self-reported to government, started working with DEA, and over the course of a year and a half probably, did a full investigation, changed all the protocols, resolved all the issue. 2 years after they reported, the U.S. Attorney held a press conference with DEA agents and said X hospital to pay $2.3 million to resolve drug diversion allegations. I'll just read you the first 2 sentences of the press release. In the largest settlement of its kind involving allegations of drug diversion at the hospital, Hospital X has agreed to pay the United States $2.3 million to resolve allegations that lax controls enabled X number of employees to divert controlled substances for personal use. In conjunction with this record monetary settlement, they've agreed to comprehensive correction action plan to prevent, identify, yada, yada, yada. They went on and gave the hospital like one line of credit, which I think 4 PR people and 3 attorneys fought for like a week. But, you know, the point was you do everything right, and yet this is how that comes out. And that's, so when you're arguing with the attorney about what the strategy is, it's pretty clear who's going to win on that one. Now, conversely, how much different is a bad actor, I would say, and we're fortunate enough that we haven't had to represent too many of them. I would put this one kind of in that category, but we worked for the law firm, and the, you know, very reputable law firm who was led by, this investigation was led by someone who had been most recently very senior in the, our Attorney General's office. And he was representing one of those, they're called retail electricity suppliers. Basically, Salesforce goes door to door and tells you, I'll lower your electricity rate and it'll be all green power, and, you know, you just have to tell NSTAR, whomever, to switch to us. And the Salesforce that they get, they strong arm, you know, it ends up being like elderly people who don't really understand, or, you know, they like, or people who English is a second language. They're preying on them, right? You know, I mean, that was my impression. And so they spent months working with the U.S. attorney, and same kind of outcome, which was like the headline ended up being that after significant negotiation, they had to pay $4 million to settle allegations of deceptive marketing and sales. Could have been worse. They managed to still stay in business, including in the state, unfortunately. But don't answer the door. But you know, it like. But the hospital and they, sort of both legal teams, had to react the same way to the situation. You know, one who had a good story to tell and one who had a terrible story to tell. And, you know, so it's challenging. And one thing, and you can only, on those in particular, you can sort of only help around the margins. You can do a lot more with a long-term plan on, you know, the good actors, I would say. So, and then I think the other piece that we find that a lot of times I don't think companies and individuals realize, particularly when you're working with an organization or a nonprofit or a small company, sometimes you're the victim. You know, there has been a person in your company who has stolen money or defrauded or done something, and you're really worried about how this is going to look. And so we're trying to help, you know, say a nonprofit that works with, well, there was one that was actually interesting. It was a small, it's a well-known national organization, but they had a nonprofit on the campus of a major university here, sometimes referred to as the world's greatest university. And the guy who was the head of it had embezzled like a ton of money. And it just so happened on their masthead, their board of directors, were some of the most high-profile people, like in Massachusetts. Some were sitting in the White House. It was going to be really embarrassing that all of them somehow got defrauded by this guy. But they were victims of a crime. So we worked with them a lot, but when it came time and we were working with the DA was willing to put out a press release that they got this guy for, you know, saves $300,000 of that he had embezzled, and they never listed the nonprofit. They just said from the nonprofit he worked for, which was extraordinarily helpful to them. And Doug and I recently have unfortunately helped a few nonprofits with charges of, you know, people in positions of trust with young children having, you know, allegations of molestation, et cetera. And, you know, the DA, local law enforcement, they'll be very protective of the kid, but they will be also, they'll try to be helpful to the organization itself. If you don't overstate what's legitimate to ask them, like, could you give us a heads up when you're going to announce this or when you're going to arraign him? And they'll try to walk you through it. And so you're ready, you tell your audience without jumping the gun before the police take their move, because that can be fatal on your end if you do it that way. But, so there are opportunities to work with them.
You know, when you're talking about the tension between lawyers and PR people or crisis managers, the classic example that I had was, it was an amusement park company. It was one of these companies that goes around from town to town and set up little amusement parks and fairs and so forth, and they had an accident where a child was killed, fell out of the ride and was killed. And the state was bringing charges, there were civil suits and so forth. The lawyer that they had was a real Denny Craig kind of character. Remember Denny Craig on the William Shatner character on, what was the show about? Boston Legal, right. And, but his strategy was no comment, we don't talk. Now, the head of the company was actually very involved in improving regulation and safety standards for this business. He was the head of a organization or a trade group that was demanding greater regulation on this. And he had a stellar safety record and a real advocate for safety of these rides and so forth. So I wanted to get that out and publicize that, and the lawyer just said, absolutely not. He believed that talking was going to affect the criminal case. So they're risk averse, and they said, don't talk. Well, they won the case. The company was found was not negligent in the case, and they won the case, but the company's out of business, had to go out of business because their name became synonymous with a child being killed. So, they went bankrupt. That's the problem. Now, could I have saved that company from going bankrupt? I don't know. But I think with a good PR plan, I think we could have got good news out there about the head of the company that ran counter to all the charges, the criminal charges. But lawyers, they're risk averse. So what can you tell them?
Right. We frequently find that they'll
Patrick, you have
tell
a-
you no comment, absolutely none. And then we'll say, well, can you say, our heart goes out to the family? Oh, yeah, you can say that. Can you say that our whole company's pulled together to, or like just some really soft stuff, and they're like, oh, well, all that's fine. And then, a lot of times on these things, all you can do is get the tone right and make sure, and I frequently tell someone, okay, read your statement, and it'll be sort of cold and whatever, we're sorry to hear this gentleman, blah, blah, blah. And I'll say, okay, now read that statement again like it was your brother. And they automatically change it. I'm like, that's who you're going, you always read it like it's a family member. And because that's the one time it's appropriate for a company to sound paternalistic, that type of, injury or accident in particular. And that's when lawyers, of course, are the most concerned because of liability.
Do you have a question?
Oh, dear. Well, I think of those as two separate things, really. Like, we've done a fair amount, particularly with Boston Globe Spotlight team, when Spotlight has somebody in their crosshairs. We spent a year and a half with Mass General working on concurrent surgery, for example. And there was a certain amount of resistance. Mass General, we've seen it with the Red Sox and other, they're used to being on the happy side of media, like the biggest breakthrough, like media generally, sometimes they have issues, but generally covers them as a positive force, right? And they all of a sudden were being accused of something. And a lot of their reaction was, look, this isn't accurate. We're really hampered by what we can say. We should just not engage with them. We had to push really hard to say, look, we can almost tell you what the story is going to sound like if you don't engage at all. And it starts, it's that thing of like, it's going to be 100% their view of the world. If we go to work, start to educate them, even if it's on background, start to get other voices in there, make sure, like really fight them tooth and nail on the stuff that, they were making assumptions about medical terms and how surgery works that was wildly wrong. And we fought. No one's ever going to know how grim that story was going to be because it was one guy's point of view that Mass General was completely outside the norm. He had told them, convinced them, outside the norm in terms of how this works, that, you have two patients open on, in two operating rooms and a surgeon going back and forth. And we got them way closer to what it what it actually is. I mean, I still think that there were giant problems with it. But so that's, anytime there's that kind of, they're doing an investigation of you, we believe you got to really fight and be in there and be educating them and be pushing back to and get your voice in there. I think that's one piece.
But the other problem, I think, where you're going with this is, I think we are in an era, not just because of the Me Too movement, but I think generally, where the allegations that would have been vetted to a greater degree by the press are not being vetted. They're just thrown in the paper or thrown on TV, and then we'll vet them in the public discourse, That's a problem. I think it's a cycle. I think it will take care of itself, but that is an issue that's out there, particularly in terms of, sexual harassment, which is, believe the woman is a fine thing. I've got no problem with that, except there's also cases where that attitude is being exploited and used, and it's getting difficult to discern which is which. So, but I think that will work itself out. But we are in I think, an unfortunate era where the press is so eager to have scoops, so eager to be first with the news. We saw it in the Boston bombing case when all of a sudden CNN is reporting they've arrested somebody, and everybody ran down to the courthouse to see him bring it. It wasn't even true. They hadn't even caught anybody yet. But they were so eager to be the first to report it that they just went on the air with it without really vetting it. And so that is a real issue and a real problem for people like us. Well, for everybody.
I mean, in response to specific of the question, what do you do with an allegation?
Well, in today's world, you have to demand that evidence be shown, that it is properly vetted, and sometimes we have to resort to investigators of our own to get data out there, to feed information. The good thing about dealing with the press is they're just information hordes. They want information. They want data.
Hoarder or whore?
That too. They want, that message, it's cliche, but, feed the beast. And if you don't feed the beast, somebody will. And so you have to be aggressive and make sure if you've got something, you feed them.
I do think, Patrick, to your question, particularly on the Me Too stuff, is there's probably two parts. There's what you say on the record, which at this point in time, if you have a tepid response, you're going to be considered guilty, right? So you have to have as firm a response as you possibly can. But then the other part is to be talking really aggressively with the reporter and the editor or producer, if it's TV, on background and say, wait, you got to tell me what you got, because you're about to destroy a man's life here. So if you're basing this on one person, has she come forward, try to reach agreement on what a standard is. You know, like, for example, the Globe, a number of years ago, probably a lot of years ago now, has a policy that they won't print a story that so-and-so is going to file a lawsuit today. Or, you know, like, the newspaper won't say, today, you know, Justine Griffin's going to file a lawsuit against Suffolk Law. They wait till it's filed, because there's too many people who throw that around. And I think that, you know, there should be a corollary, that, you know, there's got to be some level of demonstrating that there's some substance there before you print it. And, you know, right or wrong, the whole NBC thing on Harvey Weinstein, you know, their theory was he didn't have the goods yet, and that's why we didn't go for it. And then they went to Vanity Fair.
New Yorker.
Yeah, so I think it's that combination of what you see and what the background work is. And that's why we say a lot of times when it really is bet the farm, make sure you have someone who's done a lot of this, who knows how to fight. Like, there's no one better than him fighting, because he's been on the other side of it for so long and just also likes to fight.
People say I like to fight too much, but that's one criticism.
Go ahead. Involving what? Was he a swimmer there? He was, yeah. I think that, well, I'll give you
go
one
ahead.
thought, and then you tell me what you think. I think that that's where you can kind of be successful initially and on the margins, right? So probably there were 2 or 3 publications in the area that were covering it the most, and they started calling him that. And so you call that reporter and say, you know, I'm not denying he went here, whatever, but can you not say that every time? Like, can you refer to him as something else? Because once that moniker's on him, it sticks, right? And so you see if you can stop the luck taking place in the beginning, because then once it goes, it goes. I'm not sure in that one that you would have been successful, because that was his identity. He's a college kid, you know, no one wanted to touch him because he was a swimmer there, you know, varsity, whatever. But that's where you try, I think.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the details of that particular case, but generally, you know, you want to try to establish what we call a reservoir of goodwill. If you can get stories out in the realm that are connected to it, that are positive stories, then when a reporter gets pulled into a crisis situation, the first thing they do is a Google search, and if they find, you know, enough positive stories there instead of negative ones, it changes the color of the story. We were involved in a case recently, I guess we can talk about it, it's in the public realm, of YMCA in the North Shore, where one of the camp counselors was arrested for assault on a child. It was very difficult to get across to the reporters that it didn't occur at the YMCA. But we reported it. I always say we when I have a client. The YMCA, there was a counselor at the YMCA who noticed a relationship between the camper and the child that just didn't seem right to him, and he reported it. He didn't report an assault. He just said, this is weird. There's something going on here. The police investigated and found that the kid was being victimized, not on YMCA. So it became very difficult for the YMCA to deal with this, because when the story broke, it looked like it was happening at the YMCA, when really it was the YMCA that was responsible for noticing the behavior and turning him in.
I think I was a teacher.
He-
right?
And he was
As a
also,
teacher and
he was
student.
also a teacher.
So you'd really rather have be, say, teacher and student, if you're representing the wide. But
Right, but the point is, it did call for personal intervention with the reporters covering the story. You couldn't do it by press release. You had to get these reporters on the phone, explain to them what really happened, and get them on your side and try to enlist them, almost so they would be sympathetic to what the Y was going through, rather than, you know, it's an institution I'm going to try to take down. You can't do it with a press release. You need specialists who might even have prior relationships with some of these reporters, or at least knows how to talk to reporters, and try to get them, you know, to a more sympathetic place. And I think it worked in this case. I don't think people have even heard of this story, but because most of the stories that have come out now, it happened at this guy's house and his apartment, and not on YMCA grounds. So YMCA is actually being credited with spotting it, and their training kicked in, and the methods of, you know, training their counselors actually kicked in, and it was all worked out well. It doesn't always happen like as clean as that. But I don't know this case in Stanford that much, but I think you can't do it by press release. You can't do it by issuing statements.
you got to do it early.
You got to do it early, and you got to actually talk the reporters through it and try to enlist them. Doesn't always work, but.
Hi, I'm just curious if you had made that comment about no one really understands the media.
No, everybody does.
What do you think motivates reporters? What drives them every day? I'm a former reporter myself. I was driven by idealism a lot, and I felt like I was carrying the weight for them.
Well, yeah, and that's
the
great,
toughest.
and I think I was too, and but what are they rewarded for? You know, what are reporters rewarded for? They're rewarded for making a change or changing public policy, and in some cases, taking down a politician, taking down an institution. That's what they're rewarded for. So more so than writing what a great job Citizens Bank is doing. You know, we work for Citizens Bank, and they're doing a great job, believe me. But trying to sell that story to the press is harder than saying, you know, there's a bank about to go under, and you
I was
can.
going to say, a bank doing what it should be doing is not a story.
That's right.
Right, that's what you hear a lot. You know,
Well, that's it. I'm sorry, but that's it. I think Justine said it earlier. That's what the press looks for: the biggest, the best, the first, the most, the trend. If you've got, remember those things, the hoverboards that were exploding? You know, you got one, it's not a story. You got two, maybe it's a story. You got three, now you got a story. It's a trend. And reporters are always looking for a trend. If you can tie this story to a larger trend, then it becomes a big story, you know.
or as one reporter from the Globe told me recently, we don't write about the 99 out of 100 planes that land as expected. We write about the crash. I was like, thanks. But also, it reminds me, I hate to quote Larry Rasky, but I will. Larry, who's the head of the company, chairman and founder, he describes our role as helping business and media understand each other and talk to each other. You know, businessmen a lot of times will not understand a reporter and their point of view at all. And he'll further say, you know, if we do it right, the politician gets the credit, the newspaper gets the story, and the business gets the win, you know, of a deal or whatever the case may be. I mean, because also, I think, you know, businessmen expect reporters to be driven by what they're driven by, you know, and it's, you know, you guys as reporters view it as idealism, but it's also they need to drive the story. They need to be there first. They need to see if they can get it on the front page. Those are the things that are motivating or driving them, like, you know, a businessman has to get the next deal. So if you sort of understand the rhythm, and if someone's been the reporter who's covered this story 3 times in a row, maybe you don't try to go to somebody else because then you make an enemy there. or maybe you do because he hasn't been fair, and you start to understand where those levers that are available to you can be pulled.
We had a great one not too long ago. The company pitched what they wanted the story to be, and they're pitching it to me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is a page one story. I didn't tell the client this, but I'm thinking to myself, this is a page one story. So I went and talked to a Globe editor about it, and I pitched it to him, and he said, gee, this sounds like a page one story. And I went, I don't know, that's you. I don't. It's your choice. I know.
That was page one.
And it was a page one story.
Okay.
Do you think that the media is still motivated by uncovering the truth at all? Do you think that's something that they're interested in as far as these on-background conversations and clarifying what I know is to be heard, but
Yes,
background?
I do. I think, I mean, the worst thing in my experience for a reporter is to find out that they were wrong. It's embarrassing. It's, we worked on, we spent 2 years of my life working with Arthur T. DeMoulos on Market Basket. And it was such a three-ring circus. But there was a lead reporter at the Globe, Casey Ross, and he and I spent probably 6 or 8 months that all day, during the day, people all around the deal and what was going on. Most people don't really realize that the Market Basket story at its core was Arthur T. DeMoulos trying to do $1 billion deal in 3 months with the hoopla going around. And he cared about, getting the employees back, and he cared about getting the deal done so that he could stabilize the company. There were a lot of people who didn't want that deal to go through, and there were other people who were trying to compete for it, et cetera. So all day long, people would tell him stories, and they were under very strong NDAs, and they had a lot of reason not to comment. And we kind of worked out a thing that at the end of the day, it was really unfortunate because it was always the end of the day, and then I would have to go to work. But he would call and say, okay, here's what I hear. I hear this person offered this, I hear he said that, blah, blah, blah. And I cut the deal with my client, and it was always kind of arm's length, that I would make sure he didn't get it wrong. And because that was really what they would care about too, because a lot of those conversations were to try to put media pressure on what was going on there. And so a lot of times at 5, 6 o'clock he's calling, and I would have to call him back in an hour and say, okay, all of that's wrong. And and because we had a relationship of trust, he believed me. He knew that I wasn't trying to spin him. He knew that I was trying to help him, not impact it. So I think that's a good example.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying too. I think we're in a weird place right now with what is the truth and how to cover it. When the president says, I'm going to get rid of the 14th Amendment with an executive order, the president said it. So is it the reporter's responsibility to say he can't do that? And if you do, then you might look like you're being biased. The president said it. I personally think if he could just X out constitutional amendments with an executive order, he would have started with the first one. But but the press is unsure of itself right now on how to cover the truth because there's so much untruth out there.
Well, I think that's the most, I find that the most frustrating, going back to Spotlight investigations to others. Sometimes they will say, okay, this is what he said, and then we'll tell them why it's wrong, and then they'll say, okay, well, we'll print that as your response. I'm like, no, but that's factually untrue.
Right.
Well, he said it. So that is another tension.
Historically, reporters reported the facts, and that's what their job was, kind of like police officers report the facts. And then Walter Cronkite uttered these little words, and this reporter's opinion. And ever since he uttered those words, he's given reporters a whole different area to hide under, or bed and hide under, because now they can give their opinions instead of reporting.
Well, that's not completely accurate. We don't want stenographers. We don't want the press to be stenographers. This goes back to the McCarthy days when he stood up and said, I have a list of communists in the government, and it was just reported. He has a list of communists in the government. It was total bullshit. So do we want the press to be just reporting, well, he's got a list of communists in the government? Or do we want the press to say, this guy's lying? That's my opinion, he's lying, because he doesn't have the goods. So we don't want stenographers. We don't want them to report just the facts. If you want just the facts of what's going on in Congress, just go read the congressional record. You know, how many of you go to bed at night reading the congressional record? That's all the facts right there. So we don't want just the facts. But that said, if you turn on the TV now and the cable news, it's all talking heads uttering their opinion. It's the press talking to the press. You know, that's gone too far. And as a result of that, that kind of attitude is seeping into the mainstream press, the printed press. That you get more attention, you sell more copies, you get more accolades if you are on the edge, if you're offering more than just news. There's a way to cover the news without injecting opinion, but you don't want just the facts. Nobody does.
Hi, good morning. So I worked in PR, obviously, that's why I'm here. A lot of the information that's being said from different outlets, news channels, TV, all that stuff, I tend to follow or trust mostly the Associated Press. I'm on their big story news page every day. What are some other reputable hubs that are worth putting the whole story out? In your opinion?
Well, I mean, we're very lucky in that we have such a large palette. You know, we have so many sources, and we can play one off the other. For us, it requires, like I was saying, it requires involvement. I don't think I would advocate for anyone, publication or outlet, being totally fair and totally complete at all times, because it doesn't happen on a case-by-case basis. You know, I think the New York Times, you know, the New York Times takes a lot of criticism for being left, but then the Wall Street Journal takes a lot of criticism for being right. So we're lucky in that respect, and we can play, and we're thankfully, we're a two-newspaper town still, and we can play off that. We use that a lot to our advantage of playing one paper off another. The Associated Press has very strict guidelines on just the facts, ma'am. So, you know, it is a reputable outlet for just that.
I think that's well said. I still think that there's the top tier of papers when you're obviously, you know, savvy enough to make the distinction between reporting and the opinion pieces. I mean, Globe, New York Times, Washington Post, all, yes, you can make an argument on some pieces that there's a, you know, left or right bias, but a lot of them are, you know, on the factual stuff they're held to high standards.
I mean, Mass Lawyers Weekly is just a radical publication.
Yeah, so Justine, you had mentioned kind of how the AGs and all the state's attorneys come out and try to shape the narrative from the get-go. Do you guys, I guess my question, so I work for Bright Horizons, which is like a childcare company across the country. One thing that we see often is plaintiffs' attorneys who come out and really try to shape the narrative.
Yep.
And so I guess I would love your advice about, you know, how to get ahead of that and respond to that appropriately.
We have a client right now who is, you know, large, national, and controversial, and there's a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys out there just, you know, there's trying to put class action suits together, trying to, the good news, I think, on a lot of them is they don't get a lot of attention early, and you don't want to give them too much attention because they're trolling, right? I think probably what we would advise, and I don't know if this is too general, is look at what they're trying to accuse you of, right? And make sure that your facts are ready to go there, and outside opinion, should that become a news story, right? Don't necessarily respond or pay too much attention to them, but be ready to go in action. I mean, there's an enormous amount of time we will work with a company to get ready should something happen. Should a story take off, or you know, they know that something happened, and it's really about whether the media is going to find it or not. And you know, surprisingly, a lot of times it never comes to light. I think that's the type of thing. And also with your type of company, when we do crisis planning, you can kind of pick, here's the 2 or 3 or 4 buckets of if we have a problem, it's gonna be in one of these areas, particularly anyone working with children. And what would you like to say if one of those happened, that day? And, and I think you have the luxury of time, right? So I would think, for example, you'd want to be able to point to an outside trusted expert who's already reviewed all your child safety procedures, and you say, like, we do this on an annual basis, and that person comes forward. Like, you have a few of those in your quiver that you're ready, but you don't give the plaintiff's attorney too much attention.
We're running over. Anything else? Thank you very much. Hope this has been enlightening.
So we'll take a quick break, replenish your coffee, use the restroom, and we'll start up again at 10:15.
Great, thanks. No, it was supposed to be, they get 10 minutes.
Yeah, they get a break too.
You were supposed to stop talking at 10, you were correct.
I saw you look at your watch, so you were. Thank you for the.
Nice to meet you.
Putting us in with the responsible media.
right.
I appreciate
And this is
that
Doug,
a lot.
Doug works with me.
Hey, Veolia.
Hi, I'm Kristen Blake at Veolia. Nice to meet
I've heard of you guys.
you. I'm sure you have.
I get an email from you every day.
You're a crisis.
That was a great opening.
A lot of statements prepared that hopefully no one will ever say.
Yeah, I always joke that we're dropping.
Story in the Times.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Yep.
Like,
I sent it
yeah, so. But still led.
I started as a business reporter. I was covering banks. I was at a precipitous time when all the banks were failing.
Or anything you need. So what do you do there?
Made my career, so I became deputy business editor.
That experience helps in this side because we totally understand what's driving the